It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Norman Abjorensen.
Let me start this evening by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and part of a people, by the way, who are colonised, federated and Australianised without either consultation or consent. Thank you, Professor Mackay, for your introduction, and welcome to the ANU, one of the genuine and rewarding fruits, along with the ABC, of Australian federalism. There might be more, but they don't immediately come to mind. I had to think very carefully when invited to give this lecture, because it's been my experience over a fairly long period of time that the issue of federalism when up for discussion acts a bit like the full moon. It brings some very strange characteristics and proclivities to the fore, characteristics or even obsessions that are usually carefully concealed behind perfectly respectable suburban facades. I plan this evening to live up to that. I shan't disappoint you. First, some disclaimers are in order, I think. Lawyer, I am not. And in making this clear, I intend no disrespect to our generous and civic-minded hosts and sponsors tonight. Neither am I an economist, but I don't feel it necessary to apologise for that. I can promise you, however, no talk of vertical fiscal imbalance or fiscal equalisation. I mention these things that I am not for the simple reason that this talk tonight has little or nothing to do with arcane legal argument nor economic formulae which figure somewhat prominently in the discourse on federalism. This is an unashamedly and unapologetically political, in the broadest sense, reflection of what I've called our federal experiment. An experiment because we don't yet know how it will end up, what shape it might take in the future, and how it might adapt or evolve. It is and remains very much a work in progress. One more disclaimer is in order. I'm favourably disposed, as will become clear, towards the states, but in no way do I consider myself, and this is not a term we hear a lot of these days, a states writer, a category that has, I think, and not without justification, a certain ratbag quality to it, and one that has over the years proved to be a last refuge for many a political scoundrel. Some years back I attended a conference organised by the former Labor MP for Eden Monaro, Jim Snow, who was involved in a movement called Shed a Tear, which was aiming to garner support for a reduction in the levels of government in Australia from 2 to 3. I told Jim I was interested in giving a paper at his next conference, as I had some fairly strong ideas on the subject, and he said he would gladly accommodate me. What were my ideas, he asked. Getting rid of the Commonwealth, I replied. Now, Jim was an affable man, stared at me for a few seconds, the smile having already faded from his face. I see, he said after a while. Now, isn't that a novel proposition? Well, 6 or 7, it might even be 8 years later, I'm still waiting for that invitation. It never arrived for the simple reason that Shed a Tear had already identified the level of government it aimed to shed, the states. In a similar, though not nearly so tendentious a matter, Griffith University's federalism project at its admirable socio-legal centre is engaged in some fascinating and groundbreaking research, probing and analysing public attitudes towards a range of possible alternatives to the current federal structure, notably the inclusion of regions. But none of the permutations canvassed to date include shedding or even downsizing the Commonwealth, but I'm now assured that this will be rectified, and I look forward to that data. To eliminate or reduce the Commonwealth, of course, would not be easy, but nor would removing the states. And we have yet to see just how difficult becoming a republic will be, even if we vote yes in some future referendum. Tonight, I want to invite you to imagine an Australia without the Commonwealth colossus that sits uncomfortably and intrusively upon our creaking system of government. And in doing so, I want to question the notion of inevitability that somehow and quite illogically pervades historical discussion of our federal experiment in Australia. So I'd like to frame the discussion this way. Could there be an alternative parallel universe in which we have no national government, or, if we do have one, that it is a very different beast from the all-devouring monster, created unwittingly, or one might even say witlessly, by the colonies in 1901. The basis for my argument tonight is that we are an economically and socially diverse people with diverse needs, and that local identification, be that town, city, region or state, is a powerful factor in the kaleidoscope of multiple identities we assume under the rubric of Australian. I will add a further dimension to that argument, and one that assumes greater and more critical significance the further one moves away from the axis of concentrated power constituted by the Sydney, Canberra, Melbourne Beltway. And that's the idea of that the Commonwealth remains an abstraction for many Australians, despite the concerted attempts to revive Anzac and shroud Australia Day in an ersatz solemnity, to say nothing of prime ministers who exploit the national flag and other symbols for nefarious political purpose. Living in the Beltway, and especially so here in Canberra, we tend too easily to forget that in day-to-day activities it is still the state government with which the citizen will most likely come into contact. It is the states which provide social goods and services rendered in kind, as distinct from those of the Commonwealth, which are nearly all provided in the form of money. The relationship, therefore, between the people and the respective tiers of the federal system is qualitatively different, and this tends also to shape public perceptions. Finally, by way of a long, prolix and Kim Beazley-like introduction, I shall look at the tensions inherent in our government arrangements, not just the usual one of conflict between centripetal and centrifugal forces inherent in federalism, but that between the liberal and democratic elements. Tonight, I want to offer a number of questions for consideration. First, was federation really necessary? Secondly, was federation imposed on us by concealed self-interest? And finally, was there really such popular support for the federation movement as we're led to believe? But first, I want to look at an issue, and I think an important issue, about which we still know far too little. That is, what was it that really drove the process of federation? Who stood to benefit from such a development? The French have a most useful phrase which has found its way into English, cherchez la femme. The literal translation is look for the woman, and is used when a man behaves unusually or gets into a quarrel or other difficulty and the reason for it is sought. Look for the woman expresses the idea that behind a problem in question there is a woman. If I might dare to paraphrase from the author of The Count of Monte Cristo, can I suggest cherchez l'intérêt personnel, look for the self-interest. The real question that this leads to in a discussion of federalism is to ask, did we jump or were we pushed? Just when the idea of union of the diverse and scattered settlements in the Antipodes first arose is not entirely clear, but it does appear to date back as early as the 1840s. The form of federalism that was to provide eventually the vehicle for union was a very fashionable concept in the latter half of the 18th and throughout the 19th century, having appeal both for peoples who resorted to force to win their independence, such as in the United States and some of the countries of South America, as well as for those who travelled the constitutional route to political autonomy, as in Canada and Australia. The wide appeal of a federal form of government may be gauged by the diverse enthusiasm emanating from such disparate writers as Montesquieu, Rousseau, de Tocqueville, Madison and Proudhon. But Australia did not derive from political theory, even though its ultimate constitutional form was shaped by it. Nor did it begin heroically in revolution. There was no cry of give me freedom or give me death preceding the birth of the Commonwealth. No prolonged struggle or craving for independence. We were not born of an ideal. There was no great principle at stake. It was, as Manning Clark tells us, all a matter of convenience. Those who advocated it were impressed by its convenience. Those who opposed it did so on the grounds of a different notion of convenience. Indeed, Sir Edward Dease Thompson, a bureaucrat, administrator and sometime colonial secretary in New South Wales, is often credited with first alluding to an idea ahead of its time in the New South Wales Legislative Council, of which he was an appointed member, and later, that was in 1846, and he's called a decade later for a federal assembly. He has even been hailed as par excellence the father of Australian Federation. Now, an interesting character in a way. No swashbuckling Garibaldi was he, nor was he a Washington or even a Franklin. He was the Scottish-born son of the Accountant General in the Royal Navy. And the Australian Dictionary of Biography entry on him informs us that he assisted his father in the Navy Office in a variety of ways, including the introduction of double-entry bookkeeping. He was regarded as the very model of a Crown servant, a public servant's public servant. Dease Thompson then is perhaps a fitting progenitor. Australia was born not from the slash of the rapier, nor from the overthrow of tyranny, nor even from a mild defiance of imperial authority, and certainly not from any revolutionary zeal. Its origins lay in the flourish of a clerk's pen. This rather makes Canberra, in a way quite unintended by the founding fathers, a fitting national capital. Perhaps we need also to add St Nicholas, the patron saint of clerks, to our coat of arms. But then Australia's clerical origins might not have been all that great a departure from the practices that prevailed in, or indeed ruled, the mighty 19th century British Empire. It was that great iconoclastic Victorian Liberal politician and later Chief Justice, George Higginbotham, who memorably complained that his colony and the other Australian colonies were of so little consequence to the powers in London that they had become the private playthings of minor officials, and self-government counted for nothing. He went so far as to state, "I believe it might be said with perfect truth that the 1.5 million of Englishmen who inhabit these colonies and who during the last 15 years have believed they possessed self-government have really been governed during the whole of that time by a person named Rogers. He is the chief clerk in the Colonial Office." The proposal for a federal constitution found its way into the first draft of the Australian Colonies Government Bill in 1849, but was omitted from the final bill, as Lord Grey explained to the House of Lords in 1850, not because there had been any change in feeling on the part of the government, but, in his words, simply on the ground that on looking into those clauses it certainly did appear that there were many defects in the machinery which have prevented them coming into practical operation. Decoded from bureaucrat speak, it was inconvenient. In 1957, the newly created Parliament in Victoria heard from a select committee it had set up to report on the Federal Union of the Australian colonies. And the members were unanimous in recommending a system of mutual action and cooperation among the colonies. Their report said their interest suffers and must continue to suffer, while competing tariffs, naturalisation laws and land systems, rival schemes of immigration and of ocean postage, a clumsy and inefficient method of communicating with each other and with the home government on public business, and a distant and expensive system of judicial appeal exist. The worthy committee members looked at history and concluded that neighbouring states of the second order inevitably become confederates or enemies. In other words, the choice was between joining hands or taking up arms. But these words of warning were little heeded in the decades immediately after, and intercolonial rivalry reached a peak in the 1860s and 1870s. While disputes over customs duties, railway police and waterway management flared from time to time, there was never any danger that a shot might be fired in anger. It's likely that these worthy committee men in Victoria had looked at the United States, where throughout the early 19th century, New York and New Jersey waged many a dispute over their valuable shared harbour and waterways. One dispute over the boundary line through which the harbour and the Hudson River, settled by the Treaty of 1834, once led state police to exchange shots in the middle of the river. We've never had a dramatic confrontation like that in Australia, and it needs to be remembered that the American colonies had already federated when they were firing live bullets at one another, so it rather knocks down the argument. There's nothing to suggest that independent former colonies unfederated would be any different in their everyday relations from the relationship that exists today, say for instance across the Tasman. And those of you who've studied your Australian history might well recall that New Zealand took an early but later abandoned interest in joining in some sort of union. The trans-Tasman relationship is unthreatened, robust and enduring. Indeed, it might also be argued that New Zealand's admirable independence in foreign policy would not be possible were she to be encumbered with Australia's traditional baggage and historical subservience in that regard. But back here in Australia, and in the 19th century, we had a series of fits and starts on the union issue, and fits far outnumbered starts. Why was this? Simply because there was no popular support for such a move. There was no attempt at garnering popular support either for union or federation. And when the issue did begin to gain traction, it was cultural rather than political. The idea of being Australian began to be celebrated in songs and poems. This was fostered by improvements in transport and communications, such as the linking of the colonies by telegraph in 1872. Henry Parkes, whom we will meet again later, as Colonial Secretary in New South Wales, had first proposed the formation of a federal council in 1867, but the imperial authorities rejected it. Again, it was inconvenient. He again proposed it as Premier in 1880, and a conference ensued, but it took a third attempt to finally achieve agreement for such a council in 1883, and the Imperial Parliament legislated it into existence in 1885. But New South Wales, for political reasons, did not join. Enter upon the scene Major General James Bevan Edwards, career soldier, veteran of the Crimea, the Indian Mutiny, and General Gordon's ever-victorious army in China. He was the man chosen by the British government following a recommendation of the Colonial Conference in 1887 to inspect the military forces of the Australian colonies and to advise on their organisation. Unsurprisingly, for the military mind inclines not towards pacifism, he found the colonies less than prepared, but his conclusion was reached on rather questionable grounds. He recommended, among other things, a uniform organisation and a Common Defence Act. He wrote, "Looking to the state of affairs in Europe, mind you, and the fact that it is the unforeseen which happens in war, the defence forces should at once be placed on a proper footing. But this is, however, quite impossible without a federation of the forces of the different colonies." Quite apart from the fact that his frame of reference was Europe, which was not in a noticeably belligerent state at the time, General Edwards, fresh from a posting in Hong Kong and quite possibly aware of lingering goldfields sentiments in Australia, also suggested that the Australian continent was vulnerable to, wait for it, Chinese attack. It was something with which we have become regrettably familiar over the years in Australia. It was a scare campaign. Radicals dismissed Edwards as a political tout, a not unreasonable label for an imperial man through and through, who was on his way to the governorship of Hong Kong. But his report, which led to a stint as a Conservative MP in the House of Commons, he was climbing up the ladder of imperial reward. But his report provided the context for Sir Henry Parkes, who seized on it, as laughable as it was in terms of both actual and potential threats, to reignite federal proposals, after a failed attempt to work with Alfred Deakin in Victoria on a proposal the year beforehand. Edwards later claimed that Parkes saw at once that combined action for purposes of defence was impossible without a federal government. Parkes occupies a rather ambiguous place in the Federation story. But how popular was popular support? The popular histories tend to suggest that there somehow arose in the final decade of the 19th century a clamour for union, as spontaneous as it was irresistible. There was a clamour, and it was a noisy clamour, but it was nowhere near the popular epidemic that is sometimes portrayed. You don't have to dig very far to find that the clamour emanated from a group that Mr. Howard would have described as a noisy elite, the chattering class of the day. These were in the main politicians, but they had a problem, as the first attempt at federation, the 1891 conference, was one that traversed the parliamentary track and faltered. It was only debated in Victoria. Other issues like the Great Depression intervened. Local jealousies and rivalries were aroused. It lost what momentum it had gained. Popular history also tells us that the people seized the torch from the ineffectual and bickering politicians and carried the day triumphantly. This was the view put by Sir Robert Garran in his memoirs, penned some 6 decades later, when he wrote that the federal cause had been left for dead by the politicians, but was brought to life by the people. Wonderful, heroic sounding stuff, but unfortunately a little bit removed from the truth. A closer scrutiny of events by later historians has shown that it was never quite as simple as this, nor was it ever really the case. The formation of federation leagues, most purporting to be spontaneous grassroots eruptions, which we might now call an astroturf outbreak, the organisation of conferences and a steady stream of pro-federation propaganda in the press were, as historian Brian DeGarris has observed, in most cases initiated by politicians, though they often worked deliberately behind the scenes. As a leading New South Wales Conservative, William Macmillan wrote to Sir Henry Parkes in 1893, with the federal push then mired in grubby politics. I have seen Mr. Barton and I have urged the necessity of making the movement a citizens' movement. And indeed, Barton, who you will remember was our first Prime Minister, did just that, but a citizens' movement that danced to a politically orchestrated tune, and he and his confreres were the conductors. Barton was busy, very busy, setting up federation leagues, and his missionary zeal saw some 15 established in the strategic Riverina region in the first few months of 1893. Why the Riverina? Well, history tells us people there were anxious for federation. But the fact was the people in the border areas, like the Riverina, were inconvenienced by the border issues and the officialdom of 2 separate colonies. So again, we have the issue of convenience and inconvenience raising its head. DeGarris quotes a key lieutenant of the Federation movement, writing to Barton in June 1893. And this rather takes the veil of the citizens-initiated movement away. All we want is an organisation and a program. At present, we are running about looking for an enemy like a lot of new recruits and tumbling over each other. We want a general to map out a plan for campaign. A fortnight later, the same correspondent wrote again in a more urgent tone. Tell us what we are to do in order to bring about the desired result. In Stuart McIntyre's memorable description, he marvels at the way this conception of politics involved an act of ventriloquism. He writes eloquently, "The politician, having impugned his calling, has to call forth a voice that can restore its legitimacy. He instates the people as a disembodied presence, capable of an altruism that he and his colleagues can never achieve. The people are inscribed as citizens, owning no class distinction or party loyalty. They speak at his command and then fall silent as the business of government is subsumed into the commonwealth that the politicians bring into being." There were, in fact, many reservations. There was also a large degree of apathy. In some outlying parts, there was more than apathy, there was downright hostility, with Winthrop Hackett, for instance, complaining to Barton in 1891 that public feeling in Western Australia against federation amounts to absolute frenzy. Some 6 years later, a former federation activist from South Australia who had moved to Perth reported that people there were interested in nothing but making money. Some things never change. We're always told how the vote to join was so overwhelmingly in favour, a thumping majority of 2.5 to 1. But what is seldom looked at is the turnout to vote in the final ballot in 1899, at a time when voting was entirely voluntary. When we compare this to the nearest colonial elections where voting was similarly voluntary, we see a quite different picture reflected in the turnout. Although the comparison is slightly distorted by plural voting still applying in Tasmania, Western Australia and Tasmania, but not in the vote on federation. So the percentage of eligible voters that turned out to vote on union is not high. Now if we compare this with the nearest colonial election, you can see that there was, in all states bar New South Wales, there was a far greater interest in local issues if you can measure it by turnout. The yes voters as percentage of electors qualified to vote is an interesting statistic. Only in Victoria was there a majority of the eligible voters in favour of it. And if you see these two columns over here, you add up the don't care, those who didn't vote, and the no's, there are more of those than there were people in favour. So it's not exactly a stampede of popular sentiment. Now, admittedly, there were no parties working to get the vote out. But even so, these figures show quite clearly that there were more people who were against the idea or couldn't care less about it than there were pushing it.